Veronica and John looked like a perfect couple, and from the outside their marriage seemed almost fairy tale-like. John was a successful businessman, and Veronica was busy with her home and social activities. Their family life was on the beaten path, and friends looked at their happiness with envy. But over time, Veronica began to notice changes in her husband's behavior that alarmed her. At first she tried not to pay attention to it. John began to be late at work, justifying himself by urgent business and meetings. But the further she went, the more alarming it became. One evening, when John came home much later than usual, Veronica pretended to be asleep. She felt him quietly enter the bedroom and carefully place the phone on the nightstand, as if he didn't want to attract attention. Under her covered eyelids, Veronica noticed that John quickly typed a message on the phone screen before turning off the light and getting into bed. The days went by and the situation only got worse. At dinners with friends, John answered his phone more and more often, immediately leaving the room to talk privately. Veronica had no doubt that her husband was hiding something, but she lacked the resolve to ask him a direct question. She tried to drown out the troubling thoughts, convincing herself that perhaps John was really too busy with work. But her heart didn't believe it. There came a point when Veronica's patience was exhausted. One evening, sitting across from him at dinner, she took a deep breath and made up her mind. "John, I think something has changed in our marriage." "You've changed," she said, looking him straight in the eye. John didn't seem to have expected such directness. His face tensed for a moment, but he tried to pretend it wasn't a big deal. "What are you talking about, Veronica? It's business as usual. It's just that it's a tough time at work, and I have to work my ass off," he said with a strained smile. But Veronica was not reassured by this. A feeling of anxiety and uncertainty was growing inside her. One day she even dared to check John's cell phone, but to her disappointment, he always kept it with him and never left it unattended. Soon, when John was once again late for work, Veronica felt she could no longer remain in the dark. She took a desperate step and hired a private investigator to help her figure out what was going on. Her soul was torn between fear and the desire to know the truth. A week later, the detective came to Veronica with confirmation of her worst fears. John was indeed cheating on her, and not with someone from afar, but with a woman Veronica saw every day. His mistress was his secretary, a young and ambitious young woman named Emma. This news hit Veronica like a thunderclap, and her inner world collapsed in an instant. John, feeling that he might be exposed, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy with Veronica. But when the conversation turned to a possible divorce, he became really nervous. Veronica had made it clear to him that she was entitled to a significant portion of his assets and could deprive him of his financial well-being if they separated. That's when Emma stepped in and pressed John with an unexpected proposal. She persuaded him to hire a hitman to get rid of Veronica and avoid a divorce at great financial loss. So began a dark and dangerous turn in the lives of all three, the consequences of which John did not even guess. When Emma, with her inner toughness and unscrupulousness, suggested getting rid of Veronica in the most radical way possible, John was stunned at first. The thought of hiring a hitman seemed unthinkable, but the fear of losing his fortune overcame any doubts. Emma found someone willing to fulfill their order and convinced John that it was the best way to preserve his money and freedom. The hitman they contacted promised to handle the task quickly and quietly. The plan was simple. He was to break into the house on a certain night when Veronica would be alone and take her out, making it look like an accident. Meanwhile, Veronica was trying to deal with the pain of betrayal and disappointment in the man to whom she had devoted so many years of her life. Internally, she had already made up her mind to divorce, but she kept silent for the time being, waiting for the right moment. She realized that in case of divorce John would be left with practically nothing, because most of the property was acquired during the marriage, and her lawyers had already begun to prepare the documents. When it came to the evening that John and Emma had chosen for their criminal plan, everything went off script. That afternoon, Veronica's friend, a woman named Maria, with whom they worked on charity projects together, stopped by the house. Veronica invited her to tea to discuss an important event scheduled for the following week. Maria arrived early, and when Veronica excused herself to the kitchen for a few minutes, the hitman who had infiltrated the house mistook Maria for his target. There could be no mistake in this case, and the hitman did his job with cold efficiency, leaving Maria even a chance to scream. Veronica, returning to the living room, caught a frightening sight. She was shocked, but after taking a closer look, she realized that it wasn't just an accident. Someone had wanted her dead and had made the mistake of killing Maria instead. The police were called in to question Veronica, but no suspicion fell on her. The words about an assassination attempt sounded unbelievable, and the police insisted on the version of an accidental robbery that ended in tragedy. However, Veronica in her heart of hearts already knew who was behind it all. Her world collapsed again, but this time she was filled not only with grief, in her awakened rage. After the tragedy, John froze in indecision for a while. The killer's mistake caused him to panic, and he did not know what to do next. But, restraining himself and pretending as if nothing bothered him, he continued to live as if nothing had happened. To everyone he portrayed a caring and distraught husband who came to support his wife in a difficult moment. However, Veronica was not going to let it go unpunished. She managed to track down the killer, whose traces with difficulty, but found her private detective, and offered him a deal. The same man who recently wanted to take her life, now had to turn his sights on those who had set up this betrayal. Veronica offered a large sum of money and guaranteed a complete cover-up. The hitman accepted her offer. He was an experienced and cautious man named Alex, who had only made a mistake once in his entire career. He worked on the edge of the law, providing his services only to those who could pay the price to get rid of unwanted people. His reputation was built on the accuracy and flawlessness of his orders, and he never left a trace. This business is all about being invisible, like a shadow, and Alex knew how to do that. Right after Veronica offered him a deal, Alex got down to business. He started by looking into John and Emma's lives. Their daily habits, their routes, their work schedules, all of this was going to be the basis of his plan. Alex climbed into the dark corners of their lives, familiarizing himself with what wasn't conspicuous with the information he gathered. He scoured social media, setting up casual encounters, pretending not to suspect anything. He had his own methodology, and he always acted in cold blood, like a true professional. Alex followed John around the office, watching how he interacted with his coworkers, when he went out to lunch, how he got home. He noticed that John often drove his black foreign car and never used public transportation. Emma, his mistress, also worked in the same office and had a similar schedule. They often had lunch together at nearby cafes and stayed late in the evenings discussing work issues. Alex had enough time to develop a plan, and he wasn't in a hurry. In his business, every detail mattered. Eventually he found the moment when John and Emma were most vulnerable. They were going to spend the evening at the office to prepare for an important presentation the next day. Killer had just enough evidence, a snapshot of when the office would be empty and a few checks to make sure no one would be left behind. He had prepared in advance his tools and materials that he needed to accomplish the task. On the eve of the supposed strike, Alex spent the evening at a quiet cafe not far from John's office. He drank a cup of coffee, scrutinizing the company's employees and listening to conversations. His equanimity impressed those around him, but there was an icy determination burning in his eyes. That evening he pondered the details of the plan. When the right day came, Alex came to the office as before. He looked like one of the employees, in a strict jacket, with a tie and a briefcase. He looked like an ordinary businessman who had his own work to do. He walked past security, and his observation and stealthy demeanor helped him do so. Alex knew he needed to stay in the shadows to succeed, and he was a master of disguise. John and Emma stayed in the office until late afternoon. Alex waited for the staff to disperse so he could act. Time passed and finally it was just the two of them around, absorbed in their work. Killer waited for the moment when they both came out of their offices. He watched them from around the corner, listening intently to their voices. He realized that they had started a business conversation and they weren't going to split up. When the door to the office closed, Alex waited a few more minutes. He knew that when they were absorbed in their work, they wouldn't pay attention to any changes around them. His plan was to enter the building through the back entrance. He had studied the layout of the office beforehand and knew how to find his way to John's office. He walked to the door, quietly clasping the silenced pistol in his hands on the way. Gathering his wits, Alex opened the door. He didn't know how quickly things would have to happen, but he felt he needed to act quickly and accurately. Inside the office, he saw that John and Emma were sitting at the table, discussing something important, and did not expect the stranger to appear at all. The assassin fired with cold-blooded determination, his hand motionless as the bullet traveled into the darkness. Fortunately for Alex, he hit the target accurately. Emma fell to the floor before she could even scream, and John, realizing what had happened, froze with shock. He couldn't believe his life had ended so quickly. He stood up, trying to realize what had just happened, but the hitman was faster. He walked up to John and, without hesitation, shot him at point-blank range. The deed was done. Alex knew that time was of the essence. He quickly left the office as if nothing had happened. He climbed into his car, taking shelter in the dark. Time passed and the office was quiet. Alex monitored the situation and, when he was sure there was no one around, drove away. His actions were clear, coherent and unmistakable. He knew he had plenty of time to erase any evidence that might give him away. He returned to his apartment and set about analyzing everything that had happened. He knew now that he needed to back up and make sure that no traces were left behind. He took the tools he had used during the order and took them to the nearest forest, where he burned everything that could compromise him. Alex couldn't afford to relax. He stayed in the shadows until he was sure that no traces were left, and only then he could breathe a sigh of relief. After completing the order, he felt satisfaction. It was another successful operation, and Veronica was very grateful to him for it. She had taken a step towards a new life, and he had once again shown that in this world only the weak die.